This clip is going to study the respiratory system. So we are going to be tracing a particle air all the way from the nose or nasal cavity until it enters the lungs and reaches the alveoli. So let's go ahead and talk about the journey of an air particle. The first structure belonging to the respiratory system is the nose, which contains nasal cavity. Okay, so in that nasal cavity, this is where you have the respiratory epithelium that's going to produce mucus, and it's going to warm, cleanse, and humidify the air. After air passes through the nasal cavity, it's going to reach the second structure that we call the pharynx. And the pharynx is a muscular funnel, and it is composed of three divisions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx for the larynx, which is the next structure after the pharynx. Next up, we have the larynx. So the next region by which air passes is going to be the larynx. And the larynx is important because this is also known as the voice box. So it contains vocal folds that will vibrate as air passes, and this is what allows you to produce sound. All right, so now air will pass down through a very long tube that we call the trachea. And the trachea is, as you can see, made up of C-shaped or supported by C-shaped rings, and these are hyaline cartilage rings which will reinforce it and prevent collapse during inhalation. So the trachea, okay, so on the outside it's supported by hyaline cartilage, but also keep in mind that the respiratory tract is lined by an epithelial layer. That epithelial layer is called the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And so this means that this is an epithelial layer that contains one layer of column-shaped cells, but they kind of look disorganized, so hence the name pseudostratified, because it looks like it's multiple layers, but in reality it's just one. And very important is the ciliated characteristic, because they have little hair-like projections that protrude out, and their function is to propel substances up and away from the lungs in order to keep the lungs protected from harmful debris or foreign substances that might enter the respiratory tract. So keep that in mind, because this is going to line the majority of the respiratory tract from the inside. All right, next up, so as soon as air is going to pass through the trachea, what you're going to notice is then it's going to split into two divisions. When it splits into two divisions, each of those is what we call a primary bronchus or a main bronchus. So I'm going to go ahead and start numbering them. This is number 1. And so number 1 is going to be the primary, also known as main bronchus. Bronchus for singular or bronchi for plural. And as you can see, you have two, a right and a left primary bronchus. All right. Next up, what you're going to notice is that this bronchus is then going to divide into even more branches. And so the next set of branches is what we call the secondary bronchi. Secondary, also known as the lobar bronchus, again, or secondary bronchi for plural. And the right primary bronchus is going to divide into superior, middle, and inferior secondary bronchi. As for the left, is going to divide into a superior and an inferior secondary bronchi. Okay, so you have 3 on the right and 2 on the left. Okay, and so these are divisions of the primary bronchus. Next up, each of the secondary bronchi are going to divide into what we call the tertiary bronchi, also known as segmental bronchus or bronchi. Okay, and so these are drawn here for you in the blue color. Okay. So you'll have many different branches branching off the secondary bronchi. Now next up, what you'll notice is the white color. So then the tertiary bronchi are then themselves going to divide, and they're going to divide into now what we call bronchioles. Okay, so they're going to get smaller and smaller in diameter, and that's going to be the bronchioles that you're going to notice, of course, on either side of the lungs. Now each of those bronchioles is also going to divide even further, and they're going to give rise to what we call terminal bronchioles. So terminal bronchioles are even smaller and thinner in diameter than the bronchioles. And then it doesn't really end there. Air still has to make it all the way to the alveoli, and so it's going to pass on to another type of bronchiole that we call the respiratory bronchiole. So number 5, okay, is going to be the respiratory bronchiole. So each terminal bronchiole is then going to give rise to around 2 or more respiratory bronchioles. Okay, and each bronchiole, by the way, gives rise to around 50 to 80 terminal bronchioles. So just to give you an idea that you have many, many branches of bronchi, then bronchioles, etc. Okay, and so then we have the respiratory bronchioles here in red, and now this is when you notice that you're going to have what we call the alveolar sacs. And so these respiratory bronchioles are going to pretty much house the sac of alveoli, and the alveolar sac is the site of gas exchange. So this is where the lungs are going to exchange O2. They're going to send O2 to the blood capillaries that encircle the alveoli, and they're going to pick up CO2 for you to exhale it again. Okay, so finally, the last part of this pathway is going to be the alveoli. And so as you notice, if you want to zoom in, if this is the respiratory bronchiole, okay, what you'll see is that the alveoli are going to attach to it. You have an alveolar duct, and then you have an alveolar sac. Okay, and so this here is what we call the site of gas exchange. Okay, so this brings us to a very important point. The respiratory bronchioles, as well as the alveolar sacs, these belong to what we call the respiratory zone. As for everything else, so starting from the terminal bronchioles and upwards, these belong to what we call the conducting zone. Okay, because air is being conducted until it ends up at the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar sacs, and this is where respiration begins, which means that there is an exchange of gases between the alveoli and the capillaries.